All right, so having defined a vision in phase A, we need to now iteratively work through phases B, C, and D to define what kind of architecture building blocks are we going to need to fill the gaps between where we're at and where we want to go, between our baseline and target architectures in the domains: business architecture, data and application architecture, which are in information systems architectures, and then in technology architecture. So we're defining the architecture roadmap candidates to fill the gaps that we're going to define as well here, and that's going to help us derive requirements. So let's look at business architecture first, and you'll note that there's going to be a lot of similarity in B, C, and D because we're doing the same thing. We're defining the gaps. So the first objective in phase B: develop the target business architecture that describes how the enterprise needs to operate to achieve the business goals and respond to the strategic drivers set out in the architecture vision in a way that addresses the request for architecture work and stakeholder concerns. So to put this into perspective, again, using our little scenario, let's say that we had a preliminary phase and we had support, of course, for an EA practice, but having a support for an EA practice at least to where we could do a focused effort like smartphones for hotel keys, we needed a request for architecture work that gave us permission to do phase A. So that request for architecture work gave us permission to do phase A, and then we worked to be able to come up with a statement of architecture work that scoped what we were going to do and what we're going to deliver. And again, in light of certain targets, here is the capability that we're seeking, and here's how we're going to go about defining it. Well, in business architecture, and we'll see the same thing in phases C and D, what's the target architecture that's in context of that request for architecture work that considers what the stakeholders are concerned about, and then what's the statement of architecture work where we've locked in what we're going to do to move forward. And then, as I said earlier, having a target, now we need to say how are we going to get to that target. So that infers then we're going to need to do a gap analysis between where we want to go versus where we're at in the context of our architecture vision. We want to do this at a logical level where we're talking about the capability, as we said before, to unlock the hotel doors with our smartphone, right? But that touches in the business architecture area. It says candidate architecture roadmap components. Well, what kinds of building blocks would need to change in terms of roles, like receptionist desk, for example? Maybe we could have a remote receptionist desk since people are bringing their own hotel key with them in terms of their smartphones. So there's different roles there, different processes, different business services in play. So that's what we're trying to sort out, looking across the lay of the land in business. What are all the things that need to be considered and enhanced or added, perhaps even decommissioned, in order to give us that new business architecture? So that's what we talk about. What are the candidate components that are needed, that we need to call out? Let me just say that in order to do this, we don't just focus on business architecture. So when you're actually doing the ADM, you're actually working B, C, and D somewhat concurrently and iteratively. So as I call out the need for a ability to let people check in with their smartphone, and then that infers I need some kind of application. And the fact that then my receptionist desk might be remote, because it may serve multiple hotels now, because I don't need a receptionist there on site to issue me a key. So that affects my technology architecture. So I would be working iteratively between the new process that I'm talking about here with the kind of apps that are needed and the kinds of technology that would be needed to support the apps. And so I'd be working iteratively to say, okay, well, what are my requirements then as I learn from new stakeholders, looking at this change from different perspectives. I want to be capturing those and ultimately taking those concerns, capturing them as gaps, and ultimately converting them to requirements to move from where I'm at to where I want to go in this domain and in the other two domains. So information systems architecture, often called information systems architectures, since we have both data architecture and application architecture embedded inside there. There are two perspectives, two domains inside of this phase. And this is the same long wording here, essentially, but it's saying we need the target information systems architectures. And that's data and application that would describe how we're going to get to the vision, again, laid out in the architecture vision document and also captured in the statement of architecture work, and the driver for that, which was the request for architecture work, which captured initially the stakeholder concerns. So again, just different architecture building blocks are going to be in place here because they're going to be the application and data elements that have to support the scenario in phase B. But the same objective number one and the same objective number two, because now what are the ABBs, architecture building blocks, needed? Now again, we have to look at those in light of business, but also in light of technology architectures. So we have to work iteratively. So it's very important. We're not just pulling out these candidate elements to move us from our baseline to the target. We're not pulling them out in a siloed fashion. We're doing this iteratively. But there's a pattern in BCD where we have the same basic objectives, right? The same idea that what's our target, and then what would be the elements that would get us to the target in context. So technology architecture, it's a different domain. We're coming at it from a different perspective. So in this case, we're saying what's the support of D for C in light of what we're trying to do with the architecture vision, supported by the statement of architecture work, of course, and the request for architecture work that captured the stakeholder concerns. So what are the candidate roadmap components here in terms of architecture that would take us from baseline to target from this perspective of technology architecture? So that would be the network issues, the device issues, the server issues. So all the different elements that would support information systems is technology architecture. Of course, information systems then support the new business processes and services that are critical to us. So this is the sweet spot, is the right side of the TOGAF ADM, where we're defining where are we trying to go and how are we trying to get there in light of our vision, our scoped vision, and of course tied back to where the business is going and how enterprise architecture is helping the business to succeed and prosper. So this is really the most important part here for what I would call the sweet spot of enterprise architecture work, and that's the ability to define your targets and what would be your candidate capabilities to get you to those targets. Doing this in a very technology agnostic way, so you're very open-minded about this and very objective about it, and you're iterating, you're looking at things in a very comprehensive fashion, but scoped by your architecture vision, which again has a statement of architecture work that's been approved and that you need to stay attuned to. While you're doing this definition, you're of course deriving requirements, and that's the circle in the middle. So this is the key, again, the key part. We could add other circles to the right if we wanted to adapt TOGAF. Some people like to add maybe services architecture or maybe security architecture or real property architecture. But anytime you're looking at doing the math between, if you will, between your baseline and the target to come up with candidate components that would then lead to requirements that you're going to have to resolve when you move into phases E and F. Those would be circles on the right. But for TOGAF out of the book, we have these three phases: Phase B, Business Architecture; Phase C, Information Systems Architectures; and Phase D, Technology Architecture. And again, worked in an iterative fashion and in a holistic fashion to come up with really all of the capability, all the gaps in capability that need to be filled as we move into our solution space in phases E and F.